most of my members, they'll help try getting the vehicles out of the truck. You don't tow with the drive wheels on the ground. It's not rule number 1. That's a given.
Turn right on Display Road, Waterloo Regional Road 24.
7 out here on Hespeler Road by the 401, in case anybody's curious. And it's 9:59 p.m. Somebody got pulled over. What a surprise. Phantom Cruise. but one of the longest ones ever put on YouTube. Around here doesn't look too bad, excluding the fact there's construction going on, right? Per se.
In 400 meters, turn left onto Royal Oak Road. Don't look too bad either. When it's slow for traffic, it's even better for me. For the most part, it's slow for traffic. That occasional vehicle coming through, like this guy, the snowplow.
that, you know, their driving ability is better than the weather conditions. Elbow. Food, friends, fine beer. 2880 Weber Street, Kitchener. If anybody's curious. It's still -7 out right now. This gentleman here definitely just passed me. Puts himself almost into the intersection because he's in a hurry to go somewhere. Driving a white Montana CCWS 402 plate. Big hurry, but he sure in heck didn't make it around that corner quick enough.
Turn right onto Kempsey Avenue.
You're really not going to like me if he hits my truck.
In 500 meters, turn left onto Riverbird Drive.
field driver's ed, didn't he? Slid off his driveway. I don't know if you guys can see that in the camera. Field driver's ed, that's for sure. Let's go see if I can get him out of the ditch. Or the edge of his driveway, what do you want to call it?